Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll discuss the latest developments in the Israel-Hamas war, including the awful news over the weekend that Hamas has killed 6 of the remaining hostages, and the ongoing protests in favor of ending the war in Israel. We'll also cover the gradual steps being taken where David is in Ontario to liberalize the province's beer and alcohol sales and what to make of its slow movement out from underneath the government monopoly. David, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you.
News that 6 hostages, including American Hirsch Goldberg Poland, had been killed over the past weekend has produced a huge reaction in Israel and around the world. But before we get into the protests in Israel and possible next steps for the war, let me just ask for your reaction to the tragic news.
The news is heartbreaking. Hamas has added psychological torture to the cruelty of the cold-blooded murder by releasing images, videos of the people just before they were cold-bloodedly murdered, including a young woman. This has to touch every heart. I believe it must touch every heart. The reaction in Israel is, of course, even more bruised and bleeding and ripped than it is at this distance. And there's a natural human tendency at these moments to look for some solution, not to the people who are culpable, not to the terrorists who committed the outrage, but to the more reasonable people who might have done something. And that when you're dealing with human beings of such atrocious behavior as Hamas, there's a tendency, I think, in the human mind to treat them like a hurricane, a weather, an inanimate object. Well, there's no reasoning with them, but maybe if the Israeli authorities had done something different, this outcome would have been altered. And you don't want to say that that's impossible, that that's true, but it is important to remember that Hamas are human beings, monstrous human beings, but human beings. They have volition. They did this. And that to redirect your focus away from the authors of the crime to those whose response to the crime you're debating is, maybe it's not intellectually wrong, but it's morally dangerous.
Yeah, well, let me follow up precisely on that point, because as you alluded, the reaction from Israel's allies has been rather mixed. President Joe Biden's statement was quite strong. He said, quote, "Make no mistake, Hamas leaders will pay for these crimes," unquote. Others, though, David, as you said, like Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly, has responded by calling for a ceasefire. And the new Labour government in Britain actually announced that in response, it's cutting military support to Israel. What are we to make of these different responses? And maybe just elaborate a bit on why some world leaders are seemingly inclined to make tougher demands of Israel than Hamas.
Yeah, well, I think that the whole ceasefire project, I mean, you just realize how futile that's always been, because Hamas's survival depends on retaining hostages. There's no ceasefire deal without the release of every last hostage and accounting for everyone who's missing. But of course, that's the thing that Hamas can't do, because they know that as soon as they release the hostages, they sign their own death warrants, not maybe instantly, but they will all be hunted down. And the United States just in the past 24 hours has issued an indictment for Yahya Sinwar, the military commander of Hamas, and in fact, the real leader. Other leaders have. So his survival depends on holding on to hostages. So what are we talking about with these demands? And that they are issued by leaders who they list a bunch of things that their own electorates would like. An end to the conflict, release of hostages, and a future government of Gaza with no Hamas involved. But it's just, okay, that would be good. The real test comes. Canada, the Prime Minister of Canada, has issued a statement in which he, Justin Trudeau, he once flashed across the Canadian landscape like a lightning bolt, and the only way now that he realizes he's like a lightning bolt is he goes zzz, zzz, zzz. His movement is like a constant zigzag. So one day on this side of the issue, one day on that. So he has said there must be no role for Hamas in the future government of Gaza. Well, does that mean that Canadian donations will say there will be no flows of Canadian money into the region unless Canada is assured that Hamas won't touch them. Because one of the revelations of this war has been that every institution in Gaza was knowingly participating in Hamas rake-offs, starting with the
Yes.
United Nations, but many others as well, that Hamas would embed people or use these groups as fronts, and everybody knew it. It was the price of doing business. And of course, the
Yes.
Canadian government knew it too. Will that change? Will Canada end its own policy of indirect support, not to Hamas intentionally, but acceptance of a Hamas rake-off as the price of aid? Because otherwise, those words about Hamas having no future in Gaza mean nothing. And as I said, now the Justin Trudeau zig is always followed by a zag. So tomorrow he'll be on the other side of this issue, or the next day. But really, that's what we're talking about. And the horror of this war, the thing that makes it so stupid as well as heartbreaking, is Hamas set in motion events that had to end with Gaza in rubble, and extraordinary difficulty in rebuilding from that rubble because Hamas won't be disentangled from the rubble.
You and I exchanged emails on October 8th, and we published your responses to my questions. The post, David, remains one of the Hub's most widely read. The headline, which quoted you, was Hamas started the war, let Israel finish it. Nearly 11 months later, how, if at all, has your view changed on this point?
Well, look, this is my view hasn't changed, but the plea remains as up in the air as ever. Look, there's a saying in international relations: every war must end. And many wars sometimes subside into kind of frozen pieces, like India-Pakistan Kashmir frontier. It's not the war never exactly ended, but it is kind of frozen in place. The difference with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the Palestinian side can't win, but is never allowed to lose. And so that what everybody, all the incentives are, especially for the leaders of the Palestinian cause, to keep returning to the course of conflict. Maybe this time it will be different. No, it's not. Maybe this time it will be. This conflict ends when the maximalist goals of the Palestinian movement are abandoned by the Palestinians themselves as unachievable. Whether they in their hearts agree who's right or who's wrong, it doesn't matter. At some point, you say, you know what, the border is the border, the outcome is the outcome. Israel is a permanent and unchangeable reality. But in fact, we have for a long time, the Western world, been winking at arrangements in Gaza that sustain Hamas, a maximalist organization that doesn't accept the price of peace. And so peace won't come. And we're on our way to more rounds of this conflict. The war ends when everyone understands that Hamas's goals are unachievable, including the leaders of Hamas themselves, and they change those goals.
Something that also hasn't changed is that we've seen a resumption of pro-Palestinian or pro-Hamas, or however one describes these rallies in major cities in recent days. There was a huge protest in New York, where I am, over the weekend. Montreal remains a hot spot. Things are tense on university and college campuses across North America. David, I spoke with former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney about this earlier this week, and he said that we've come to tolerate in our cities expressions of anti-Semitism that can sometimes sound like you're in 1933 Germany. It prompts the question, how do we let this happen? Do we need to be more hard-headed about the limits of pluralism?
Yeah, well, it's not just expressions of anti-Semitism. And maybe a free society does have to live with a fair amount of that. It's outright violence. It's shootings at schools. It's bomb attacks. And my assumption is that many of the groups that are involved with this do have a high degree of police penetration. The Canadian police forces are maybe not always as professional as their as EU, UK, US counterparts, but they're professional enough. I suspect that they have some open windows into what's going on. And the question is, how hard do governments want to respond? And I think there is a Canadian tendency to say, well, the shootings look pretty symbolic. They take place in the early hours of the morning. No one's been hurt. We don't have to act too decisively yet. And that is a very dangerous way to think. So the first has to be zero tolerance of violence and zero tolerance of incitement to violence. And then there have to be not legal and not governmental, but social penalties for people to take part in this. I mean, look, it is not illegal, and it shouldn't be illegal to say anti-Semitic things, even on a street corner. But you don't have to hire people who say anti-Semitic things on street corners, and they don't have to be. And universities certainly don't have to platform such people. And it is possible for universities to say, on our own ground, because their rules can be stricter, we don't allow this. And when you, for example, tear up the sod on the McGill campus, look, that's petty mischief. But there are real penalties for petty mischief, and they should be applied.
Yeah, well said. Talking about pluralism, let me ask you about your perspective concerning the protests in Israel. What do you make of them, and what are their significance?
Yeah. Well, look, they date back to this mistake early on, which is that Benjamin Netanyahu did not immediately resign after October 7th. There's a story, maybe apocryphal, maybe exaggerated, I hope it's true, but President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, calling the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, after the Bay of Pigs disaster in 1962. There was an attempted CIA overthrow of the Castro government. It was a fiasco. And the story goes that Kennedy called Allen Dulles and said, after a disaster of such magnitude, if we lived in a parliamentary system and I were prime minister, I would have to resign. But we don't, so you do. I hope that's a true story. But Israel is a parliamentary system. And the question of whether it's Netanyahu's fault that the worst security disaster in Israeli history happened while he was prime minister, that's going to be a complicated one. There probably were many people whose fault it was. But he should have resigned. And he should have taken the blame upon himself and gone into ended his career. Now he's not the person to do that. Then the political system should have forced him to do it. And so, in a way, what is happening in Israel is Netanyahu's being held to account belatedly for the things that he should have been held to account for in October. But I think Israeli public opinion is asking for things that are impossible. I don't believe it's ever been true that there was a ceasefire. The United States wanted a ceasefire deal. And in that way that diplomats do, the way you promote a deal is by insisting that the deal is near, even when it's not.
Yes.
And that's just part of the diplomatic process, is maintaining hope and trying to narrow the distances between the parties. But it was never true. It was never true, because the Israeli bottom line is we want our hostages back. We want to make sure that this can never happen again. And the Hamas bottom line is we want to make sure that it can happen again, and keeping at least some of the hostages is indispensable to making sure that it can happen again. And there's no closing that gap. That's what wars are for. And so the way to peace is to avoid wars, but when wars come, you want to fight them as decisively and rapidly as possible. And this kind of stop and start conflict that has been happening is the way to prolong the misery and reach the most inconclusive result that ensures that there will be, as there have been in the past, more and more rounds of this. Hamas needed to be beaten as fast as possible, driven out of Gaza as fast as possible, as many of the hostages retrieved and saved as possible. And then the curtain brought down on the conflict decisively with a real meaningful ending.
Well, you anticipated my next question, which is what's likely to happen next? What does resolution even look like?
What's likely to happen next is the way these conflicts so often end, is with a very imperfect resolution that sets the stage for the next battle. Israel has not been able to extract all of its hostages. My guess of what happens is some kind of deal is ultimately brokered where quite a number of the hostages are released and others Hamas probably kills, tragically, brutally. And then Hamas leaders get some kind of rescue. Hamas retains some kind of presence in Gaza, and some flow of that. There's some reconstruction aid from the Middle East, some from the less pro-Israel European governments, and no aid from the United States. And if there's and then the Canadian role will depend. I think the present government would allow aid to a Hamas-contaminated Gaza. The next government probably won't allow aid to a Hamas-contaminated Gaza. But Canadian aid is not that much in the scheme of things, so it's of interest to Canadians.
There's no smooth transition from such a sober and serious topic to an unsober topic, so I won't bother trying to make one. Let's just move the conversation, David, now to the province of Ontario's arcane liquor laws.
Sure.
You've spent another summer in Prince Edward County, so you've had a close vantage point to see the province's monopolistic sale of alcohol and beer. The current provincial government has committed to opening up the market, including permitting the sale of beer at 7-Eleven stores. I've been struck, David, by the strong reaction to the government's announcement. What about you?
Yeah. Well, and of course there was a strike at the LCBO
Yes.
this summer, which had. I'm in a pretty small town. I mean, there are two LCBOs nearby me, one in the town of Wellington and one in the town of Picton. And in a small town like this, you see the faces of the people who work there become very familiar. And I don't, you become friendly with them and you have exchanges. And obviously, it was a hardship to them to be out. And what they are fighting for is the LCBO offers people middle class security and payment for essentially retail work. And that is something that just isn't available in very many places. And obviously, the people who have it want to hold on to it. But the LCBO has always suffered from this dual mandate, which is the C stands for control. It begins with the true statement that alcohol is dangerous and that you want to regulate how it's sold. But it's also a rent extracting monopoly for the government. And so it wants to promote alcohol sales. And so it fails on both grounds. I don't notice that Ontario does any better than comparable jurisdictions in the United States at fighting alcohol abuse. But it does have this monopoly that is that where cronies of the government get top jobs, where the government gets revenues without proper taxation in an accountable way. You know, the old American slang, no taxation without representation has its flip, which is no representation without taxation. It is dangerous for governments to have unaccountable sources of money, whether that's oil sales or liquor sales. You know, I completely respect the anxieties of my neighbors who work at the LCBO, and they're going to need some kind of buyout package. But this can't continue. The control mission has to be separated from the retail mission. Canada is experimenting with cannabis as to whether it's possible to do that. I noticed they did not create a cannabis monopoly because they knew it gave the government, it created a conflict of interest to the government. Let the merchants sell, let the government regulate and restrict.
Yeah, well, I'd go even further. There's something odd whereby Ontario has an extensive policy of harm reduction for addiction and drugs, including needle exchanges, soft injection sites, and so on. And yet we're precious about being able to purchase a six-pack at the corner store.
Yeah.
What do you think explains such an obvious dissonance?
Path dependency, lethargy, interest group capture. Look, Ontario tends to have one party in power for long periods of time. And the LCBO has always been a powerful source of patronage reward for people who serve the party. And governments are very reluctant to give it up. It's also the placement of LCBO stores is a powerful political benefit. Some locations get them, and they can anchor. In the days when we had more shopping malls, they can anchor a shopping mall. They can anchor a downtown. Some people don't get them, and that again has always been riddled with favoritism and patronage in Ontario. So the government talks about control as its rationalization, but its real purpose has always been this is a powerful patronage machine, and governments have not wanted to give it up. And so it's very one of the things I applaud about the Ford government's explorations is what it's doing is it's not just deregulating monopoly. It's actually saying, here is something that has been a powerful and improper tool of government, and we're prepared to give it away.
Let's wrap up, David. It's your last week in Canada. You've spent the better part of the summer here. Why don't you reflect on your summer and some of the big issues and topics that you'll be looking forward to as you return to Washington for the fall?
Well, of course, there are two great questions for Canada. One is, will the success of North American inflation reduction allow Canadian interest rates to be brought down and thus to strengthen the Canadian economy and enable people to have a better chance at buying the houses they want. And the second is, what is the outcome of the American election, and does Canada face a malignant protectionist or just a bumbling protectionist administration? One of the problems that Canadian governments face is while the Trump administration was the most protectionist since Herbert Hoover's, the Biden administration was the second most.
Yes.
And uh, uh, it's encouraging that as a candidate, Vice President Harris has attacked the Trump tariffs. The question is, does that promise that if she's president, that she will also reduce the Biden tariffs, or is she's drawing some distinction that their tariffs are bad, but our tariffs are? But we're going to have a new government in Mexico, and one of the great failures of the past half decade was NAFTA needed to be brought into the 21st century. The deal that replaced NAFTA, negotiated by the Justin Trudeau government and with the Trump administration, was that basically let's save as much of NAFTA as possible by making a lot of concessions to Trump protectionism. But it's still needed to have a trade agreement that brings North America into the 21st century, that plans for trade in an online economy, that expeeds the flow of lawful goods and services across the three borders, or across the two borders of the three countries. That's going to be important. And we hope to have a more trade-friendly administration in the United States. There may be a more enterprise-friendly government in Canada. The outlook for Mexico is dark and dire. We can talk about that another day, the new administration and the new Congress in Mexico. But we, meaning our community, have real work cut out for us, because if we are seeing the end of the career of Donald Trump, we're going to be closing an especially malignant chapter in North American politics. But we're going to face, even without Trump, a world in which enterprise and trade and private initiative have less political support, are more under fire than at any time since the 1970s.
Yes.
And it's going to be important to raise the flag and to say, you know what, tariffs, still bad. Enterprise, still good. Government-directed investment, still a failure. Protection of private property rights, even as those property rights shift from the physical to the digital domain, really important. A lot of our AI debate is all taking for granted that private property rights are something that technology companies can play with at their whim. They don't belong to the if you make a fake image of Taylor Swift and have her endorse a candidate she wouldn't endorse, that's not just a crime against the electorate, it's also a crime against Taylor Swift. And she should have legal recourse against the people who do it to say, I own my image. You can't steal my property any more than you could in the days of physical posters. So the things and causes that the hub upholds or tries to uphold, they're going to be more necessary than ever, but we hope in a more normal context after November.
Well, we've been glad to have you back in Canada over the course of the summer, and I'm looking forward to picking up the conversation this fall, including in a live event that we'll be doing in Ottawa on September 18th. David, I want to thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.